just going to go over, types of test questions, test question formats. And I'm sure you've probably seen all of these at some point in your life, right? So there's like true or false questions, and then I'll kind of talk about what your grade means on the true or false questions. There's multiple choice questions, multiple select questions, and other types. So I'll just go over each of them. So for example, you can have a true or false question. There's a statement and you have to decide is it true or false, right? Now, in a question like this, you either check true or false. And if you don't know anything about this topic, well, you still have a 50-50 chance of getting it right, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and if you know the topic very well, you'll get it right 100% of the time. Okay, so that's the true and false style question. Then there's the multiple choice style of question, where you're told, you're given a bunch of choices, and one of them is true, and all the other ones are false, right? And you have to pick out which one's true, right? So, in this, now, if you don't know anything about this question, you have what chance of getting it right? If you don't know anything?
1 in 2, 5.
Yeah, one out of 4, right? One out of it depends on how many choices, right? But 1 out of 4. Okay. So, so if you know nothing, you have 1 out of n chance of getting it right. And if you have some knowledge, maybe you could increase your probability of getting it right. So maybe this would be a little bit more accurate than a true or false test. Then there's the idea of multiple select. The multiple select question means you're asked a question, you have a bunch of choices, and some of them may be true, some of them may be false. They could all be true, they could all be false, and you have to decide which ones are true and which ones are false. So, here you have to decide which ones are true, which ones are false. Do you guys happen to know the answer to this one?
No.
No? Okay. All right. So let's say, for example, let's say the first choice and this last choice are true, and the two in the middle are not true. Okay. So 0 to all answers might be true, and you have to decide which ones they are. So they call this style of question multiple select. And a lot of times teachers are afraid to ask it because students will think it's multiple choice and go, oh, one must be true and the rest must be false. So as soon as they pick one, they feel they're done. So, if you think about it, a multiple select question is really just a group of true or false questions, right? They're just grouped together. So instead of saying which of the following are in the Beatles, and then you have to decide true or false, true or false, true or false, you could ask them as a bunch of separate true or false questions. It's really the same thing. So you're saying true or false, Ringo Starr is in the Beatles. And then a separate question, true or false, Boy George is in the Beatles, right? And then you have to answer each one. You have to say true here, and false here, and false here, and true here. And then you could get some right and some wrong. So nothing too fancy about multiple select, but it throws off a lot of students, that all it really is a group of true or false questions. Okay. Then there's other types of questions like fill in the blank, right? So you're given like a sentence and then there's a blank and you have to put in something, maybe a number or a word or something, not a paragraph. And so, do you know the answer to this one for modulo 3?
1.
It's 1. And how did you figure that out?
The remainder.
It's the remainder, right? Okay, so what you do is you do 4 divided by 3, which is 1 remainder 1, right? So 4 divided by 3 is 1 with a remainder of 1, in integer division. Okay, so if you wrote the number 1, you would be correct, right? But you might have thought it's 4 divided by 3, and you put that 1, not the remainder 1. You put like the wrong 1, but you got the question right anyway. You just got lucky. You don't know what you're doing, but you got lucky and you got it right. You could think it's 4 minus 3, and that's 1 also. You might get it right that way too. That's another way, you don't know the material, but you're getting the question right. So then another thing a student could do is write, let's say, a 3 and a 1 and a 9 and a 5. Now, are they right? Right? Would they be right if they gave 4 answers to the question and one of the answers was right? And 3 of them. So then they'll say, oh, I need partial credit. I got the answer over here, and say, yeah, you got the answer right over here, but you got it wrong over here. And then, all right, so as much as fill in the blank seems to give a lot more, is asking a lot more of the student than just true or false, and you can kind of get the questions right half the time and not know what you're doing. This one you might think requires more knowledge. It ends up being a hassle with grading. And if you do this on an electronic test, where you have to type a number in, or a word, or a sentence, sometimes people misspell a word and then they get graded wrong even though they kind of had it right. So you have to go to the judges. Let's see if the judges let this answer count. So there's a lot of room for partial credit and arguing on fill in the blank style questions. Another type is matching columns. Do you ever get matching columns questions? What is that?
No, we had them, but not right now.
No, yeah, when you were younger?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like for younger kids, I guess. But the idea is, let's say you have a bunch of countries and you have a bunch of capitals and you have to match ones, each one up with each other. Well, it turns out the style of this question, you're either going to get 0 right, 1 right, 2 right, or 4 right. There's no way to get 3 right. If you get 3 right, it forces you to get the 4th one right. And then, so the idea is to match the country with their capital. And on average, you're going to get 1 out of n correct. Kind of like the multiple choice questions. Consider the first one, you have to pick one of these and get it right. Now, if you happen to get the first one right, then your odds on getting the next ones get improved. So that's kind of, the style to this question is try to get the one you know best, match that one up, and then that gives you better odds. So the sequence in which you get them could help you get a better grade. Okay. And then there's the standard type, fill in the answer. Just here's a big piece of paper and write all over the paper and get your answer. So you have a lot of tests like this where you have a double integral and you have to have a whole page to write out the answer, or just write a big long essay. So the issue with this, describe a guitar. Well, you could just go on forever and ever and describe it somewhat correctly, but not quite correctly. And it's subject to the grader reading the answer and deciding how much partial credit to give you. So it opens the door to a lot of guesswork, and your grade's not quite. Your grade is very connected to the mood of the grader at the time it was being graded. So, do you ever have questions like that where what the grader gave didn't quite match what you thought?
Yeah.
Okay. And sometimes you might see your classmates gave it the same answer but got more credits or less credits, and it's the same answer. It's subject to a lot of grayness. Okay. So there's a professor here at the university who works for, during the summer, works for ETS, the testing service that does the GRE exams, and they have an essay, and so he's one of the graders for the essay. Well, people all over, students all over the country, all over the world, write this essay, and then they give them out to various graders. And if you get an easy grader, you'll do well. If you get a tough grader, you'll do poorly. It's not the same person on the same day in the same mood grading your essay. Okay. All right, so now I just want to go back to some very basic statistics on true or false questions. So if you're asked a true or false question, or multiple select questions, which are really groups of true or false questions, if the test taker knew nothing and took a true or false test, right? So like if I took a true or false test in Portuguese, I don't know any Portuguese, I'd probably get a 50 on the test, right? I'd get half of them right, half of them wrong. So expected number correct would be half of them. However many questions are right, I would expect to get half of them right, and that means I don't know anything if I got half of them right. So the probability of getting all the questions correct, every single question, we know this from computer science, would be 1/2 to the n. right? Because the probability you get one right is a half, the probability you get two right is a half times a half, which is a quarter. The probability you get three right is a half times a half times a half, which is 1 out of 8. So if you had a 10-question test, or what is it? Okay, sorry. So let's say I had a 32-question test. The probability you get everything right and you know nothing, you only normally you'd get half of them. The probability that you'd accidentally get them all right would be 1 out of 4 billion, or 1 out of 4 gig. 4 gig. Right? If it was a 10-question test, the probability of getting them all right, and you have no idea what you're doing. Like if I took a test in Portuguese, 10 true or false questions, I got them all right. What's the chance of that? Well, it'll be 1 out of 1,024, which is a little bit less than 1/10 of 1%. Okay, it can happen, but it'll be somewhat rare. What I'm trying to get at is, so the statistically, giving a true or false test where you only have 10 questions might not get a good, accurate reading on someone's grade. If you wanted to convert how much knowledge someone has from their grade on a true or false test, the formula for doing that is the amount of knowledge you have is 2 times your grade minus 50. So for example, if a person knows nothing, they might get a 50 on the test. Their expected value is a 50. If a person knew half the material, that means half the questions they're going to get perfectly correct, the other half they're just guessing. But the guesses, they're going to get half of those right, so they'll get a 75, even though they only know 50% of the material. Right, so this is the kind of formula that converts a true or false grade to your approximate knowledge of the material. So, for example, you might see a grade distribution look something like this. So here's a class with 172 students. The average grade is, the statistics on the grades are 66.4, the median is 68.5, the highest grade is 99.5. And the grades might look something like this, with the average somewhere around there. So the question now we want to ask ourselves, what is the probability that the grade you got and the actual knowledge you have are like far from each other? So just to look at a few extremes, suppose you had a 10-question true or false test, and you scored, if you have no knowledge at all, you're expected to get half the questions right. Now the question is, what would be the chance? You'd be expected to get a 50. What is the chance that you would actually score all the way up to 100? Just to see if 10 questions isn't statistically enough questions to ask. The probability that you would score 100 is, like we said before, 1/10 of 1%. It'd be rare, could possibly happen, but it'd be rare. If you had some knowledge of the material, if you knew half the material, that means you're expected to get 75% of the questions right. Well, if you took 1 divided by 75 raised to the 10, that'd be about a 5.6% chance you could get 100 on the test, and you only know half the material. You deserve a 50, but you accidentally got 100. The 5% chance, that's very, 20 students, it'll happen once on average, right? So the point I'm trying to get at with these charts is 10 questions would just not be statistically enough questions to be able to say, oh, this person deserves 100. There's a good chance they got 100 and they deserve the 50. And the same would be the other way around. Well, no. If you had 100% of the knowledge, you'd always get every question right. You'd always get every question right if you knew everything. Okay. But what I'm trying to do is, it's not like a statistics class. I'm just trying to say with this number of questions, it's hard to say your grade matches your knowledge of the material. But if we went to a bigger set of questions, like 32, because we always use 32 bits in computer science, then the idea of a person who has no knowledge, which means they on average get 50% of the questions right, what's the probability they get them all right? It's 0%. It's obviously some small number, but it rounded off to the nearest percentage and 2 decimal points after the percentage. It rounded off to 0. A person who knows 50% of the material could get 100 on the test, but it's less than 1/100th of 1%. Almost no chance of happening. A person who deserves a 64, which is a very high F, right? Because we said 65 and below is an F. the chance that that person could get 100 is, 0.17%, far less than 1% chance. And then a person who knew 80% of the material, who's expected to get a 90, if they took a 32-question true or false test, there's a 3.5% chance they're going to get 100, and they really only deserve an 80. So there's still a little room for problems here. As the student knows more and more material, the more likely it is that their grade doesn't quite match their score. But then if we went up to 72 questions, then it's all zeros, except for the case where the student who knows 80% of the material, who was therefore expected to get a 90, takes a 72-question true or false test. There's a 1/2 of 1/100th of a percent. They could get them all right when they really only deserve an 80. They would get 100. So it's more like this many questions would put you in a position where this would squish together, and your grade on the test and your knowledge would be very, very close to each other. I'm going to do a whole lecture on the statistics of how many questions give you what kind of confidence interval. Okay, so does that, so like I say, this is kind of a little just introduction to the different types of questions there are. And just a little bit of a taste of, depending on the style of questions you ask, you have to ask a high enough number of questions before you can say, this student's grade is, I'm confident within 98% chance that their grade matches their knowledge of the test. True or false is, there's no room for a grader's opinion. You're either right or wrong. In that sense, it's good, but you do need to ask a lot of questions before you could say the grade matches the student's knowledge. Does that make sense? Would you have any comment on that? No? Okay.